Okay, welcome to part 2 of our deep dive on what I remember of the development of Anthem. Today we will be focused on the part of the game that I was actually leading. So starting in 2017 and going right up to launch on February 22nd of 2019. And then the last part 3, will be from launch up until now as the game is closing down. One of the massive consequences of the leadership situation that Anthem had been running in from 2014 up until now in 2017 for 3 years was that it had developed this highly dysfunctional relationship with decision making. Decisions were often not made at all when they were desperately required to be made, or they were made and then remade and litigated and relitigated constantly by different groups of people. Because the project had become very siloed by department, what tended to happen was that if a decision could exist entirely within a single department, then it often got made by that department and that department alone, with no consultation or communication to the other departments. But of course, the reality is that very rarely is that actually true. So what actually happened was decisions would get made by, say, the design department. And that decision would exist for a while within the design department. The design department would work with that decision. And then the art department would realize that that decision had been made and that it affected them in a negative way. And one of two things would happen. Either that decision would now be overridden and remade by the art department and go to the opposite form of the decision. And then you might see that decision bounce back and forth between two different conclusions between what art wanted and what design wanted, and never actually settle on a final result. Or what often happened is the moment that point of conflict occurred is the decision would essentially just become unmade and enter into this quantum state of no decision existing. And when I came onto the project, there were massive numbers of decisions in this state, where the can of decision making had been kicked down the road over and over again, to the point where massive numbers of decisions that affected other decisions behind them were piling up on the project and preventing the game from coalescing into something that could actually ship. The thing is, games are made out of decisions. So if you aren't making decisions, or if you're constantly undoing the decisions that are made, you aren't moving towards having a game. In the past, I've mentioned my belief that every game requires a certain number of builds in order to ship, and that number of builds is dependent upon the game. And the more quickly you can generate builds, the more efficiently you can ship your game. And I think this is related to that. I think making a build of your game is, if not locking in, at least firming up the decisions that exist within that build. So making decisions, making builds, generating a certain degree of doneness is required for your game to ship. One of the primary jobs of production, from my perspective, is to get decisions made. It's not that production necessarily should be the ones making the decisions, but they should be providing the environment through which decisions can be made. The other major part of production's role is to guard the decisions that have been made. I really believe in Chesterton's fence, which says that you shouldn't tear down that fence until you know why it was put there in the first place. I believe that a decision that has been made should be given an immense amount of weight simply by having been made. That's not to say you can't change the decision, but it does mean that you need to understand the reason that decision was made in the first place before you just override it. And what had been happening quite often on Anthem up until this point is that made decisions bore literally no momentum, had no power. If anything, had negative power. People were almost eager or gleeful to override existing decisions. So as Jason Schreier talks about in his article about Anthem, one of the things that I did for quite a long time, probably the first 6 months or so, was force a bunch of decisions to be made. Force the project to decide on what it was and what it was doing. And as you make those decisions, as you allow seed crystals of decision making to form, the rest of the project can crystallize around those seeds. Until you're willing to make decisions, the project can't do that. It just exists in this fluid state, never settling down at all. And that's really what had failed to happen on the project for 3 years while Casey was gone. One of the decisions that bounced around a lot on Anthem before I came onto the project was whether or not the game was going to be client-server or peer-to-peer. The game that ships is client-server, but there was a continual pressure from certain groups to make it peer-to-peer. A peer-to-peer game doesn't have dedicated servers that are running parts of the game logic off of the computers or consoles that are playing the game. Instead, everything is spread around amongst all the people who are playing the game. So there's a fairly obvious advantage there because you don't have dedicated servers, or at least not dedicated servers running game logic. Your server costs are close to zero. They may be not zero, but they're very, very low. When you have a peer-to-peer game, you typically have someone who has host powers. They're not running a server, but they are effectively given the role of being in charge of the match that is going on. Modern peer-to-peer games like Destiny typically have fairly sophisticated host migration, which means if the person who is designated as the host drops off for whatever reason because their internet provider got struck by lightning, the game is able to continue relatively seamlessly by moving who is in control to one of the other players. Sophisticated host migration is actually a relatively difficult problem that can take a lot of time to solve. In the past, peer-to-peer games often didn't have host migration at all. If the host went down, the match ended. But these days, most players are expecting something a little bit more robust than that. But the other difficulty with peer-to-peer is you're now running more of the game on all the people playing the games. On PC, that can be relatively easy to deal with because you can just raise your min spec if necessary. But on consoles, you're dealing with very tight constraints. So a peer-to-peer game is typically going to have to make sacrifices in other places in order to have the computing power in order to run the parts of the game that otherwise would run on a dedicated server. If you're client server, then somewhere out in the cloud, there are computers that are running most of the game logic. And then the clients, the people playing the game, are drawing the graphics, and they will have some degree of prediction or other logic to reduce latency that might otherwise interfere with the experience of the game. But you've offloaded a bunch of the actual game onto a computer that is somewhere else. This comes with cost because if you're running on the Amazon cloud system, then every time someone wants to play a game, then you're going to spin up a server and you are going to have to pay for that. If you haven't optimized that server, that can become pretty expensive. The game had always been intended to be client server, and that was how it was architected. But when I came on the game basically was a single player game. It had this concept of being client server, but it was running these servers locally on every single person as they started up the game. There was no server running somewhere else. As a result of that, the decision had remained open. It had been decided, but like a lot of the other decisions on the project, this was free to be relitigated endlessly. So one of the early decisions that I made was deciding that, yes, indeed, we are going to be client server. Was it the right decision? Maybe. It was the right decision if it was going to be a successful live service. A lot of the work that the Anthem Next team was able to do while the game was out in the wild was only possible because they could change the logic on the servers without having to issue a patch, without having to go back through cert. A client-server architecture for a console game increases your agility when you are out in the live service, but it comes with that cost. There is a dark pattern that is completely my design in Anthem, where it is actively discouraging a player from playing the story missions by themselves. Because if you play a story mission, it has to spin up a server. If you're playing with 4 people or 1 person, the cost of that server is basically the same. So if people were playing the game as if it was a single player game, the costs were way higher. So there is a dark pattern in the mission start where it is trying to essentially trick you into looking for other people to play with you. We'll talk about the storytelling in Anthem and why it wasn't really well designed for a group of random people a little bit later, but that dark pattern was there because of the decision of the way the network architecture was going to work. I don't believe that we had the time or expertise to move to a proper peer-to-peer architecture. So I do think ultimately, even now, it was the right call to stick with the client-server architecture, but it was a point of contention early in my tenure as executive producer on Anthem in 2017. But the reality is, staying on the topic of decision-making, is that the project needed to decide something. Either decision would have been better than where it was in this state of churn, as it was constantly rediscussing the same topics over and over again and never committing to a direction. So if the project had decided to go peer-to-peer and invested in trying to do host migration and in trying to optimize the game to run on consoles better, it would have gotten something out of that as well. By staying in this limbo of that decision not being made, it wasn't able to start to do the work that existed down only one of the 2 paths. So sometimes any decision is better than no decision. When I came onto the project, there was only one mission that existed. That mission was Den of Wolves. That mission is still in the game today. I don't think it's still called Den of Wolves. I searched to see if I could find it on the internet, and I couldn't prove that it did exist, so it's possible that its name got changed. Den of Wolves isn't a great mission, but it existed. And so the thing that I said to the team was, finish this mission, move on, make a second mission. But that's not what happened. The team burned that mission down and built it again, built a new Den of Wolves. One of the very first videos I did on this channel was talking about making more pots, about getting quality through making more of something, as opposed to constantly restarting the one thing that you're working on. And that video is basically in direct response to this Den of Wolves moment on Anthem. One of the problems that Anthem has in its missions is it doesn't really have enough activities for the players to do. There's a pretty limited palette available to the level designers to build these missions out. But when you're only making a single mission, that limitation isn't as obvious. If the team had done what they had been told to do, if they had set Den of Wolves aside and gone on to build a second and third mission, some of these limitations that are hurting the mission quality in Anthem would have become obvious earlier, perhaps early enough to have actually addressed the issue. But instead, we continued to work on Den of Wolves for another several months, and by the time it was clear that the project didn't have enough activities within its missions, it was frankly too late to really do anything about it. So this part, not going to be super fun. One of the things that I inherited when I took over this project was a very strained relationship between BioWare Austin and BioWare Edmonton. All of the leadership for Anthem at this time was in Edmonton. Due to poor systems in place in order to understand that other team, due to poor communication, due to poor team structure, there was a fair amount of distrust in Edmonton as to the effectiveness of the team in Austin. On the other side, there was a fair amount of distrust in Austin as to the effectiveness of leadership coming out of Edmonton. A lot of the leadership methods that have been used in BioWare historically depended upon a fair amount of face-to-face, high-touch, kind of loose strategies about walking to someone's desk and bumping into people in the hallway and taking people out for lunch and other very soft kind of interactions. But of course, when you are in another country, very far away, none of those strategies really work, and you need to adopt new strategies. I do think these strategies are doable. I think that there are studios that have a structure that looks a lot like Anthem structure that do succeed. And now in a post-COVID world, some studios are fully distributed. The place where I messed this up was that I was in Edmonton. I was surrounded by the leaders of the project who distrusted the effectiveness of the team in Austin. And that was the bias that I picked up. I similarly didn't put in the time to completely understand what was going on the ground in Austin. And it resulted in me making some big missteps when it comes to Austin. As the project went forward, I think this did get better. And I would argue that maybe the primary reason it got better was because the project started to have leaders on the ground in Austin. We had senior producers in Austin, and we changed who was the technical lead on the project and went from someone in Edmonton to someone in Austin. And as a result of those things, we ended up in a situation where that leadership was more distributed. And the people that were having high degree of interaction, which is typically people at roughly the same seniority level, they at least had representation in all locations. One of the things that was happening in the early days was that you had teams spread across both locations. The leader and, say, 50% of the staff would be in Edmonton, and then the remaining 50% of the staff were in Austin. The conclusion I've come to is that that is not a structure that is functional. The thing that I have said is that a person can be remote, a team can be remote, but people can't be remote. And what do I mean by that? If you have a team which is all in one location and a single other person is in some other place, maybe they are working from a boat in the South Pacific, that can work because it's very clear how that communication is supposed to work. There's a single isolated person. They are going to be responsible for most of keeping themselves integrated into the team. If you have a team in another location, then what you have is leaders as well in that other location. And now the communication, again, is relatively clear because the leaders of that team and the leaders that they report into are responsible for maintaining that channel, are responsible for keeping that team informed. And again, that's functional. But when you have people, when you have a significant percentage in another location, then it's not so clear. This is one of the reasons why I'm very suspicious of hybrid work environments, is because I think it puts you into this middle case. I think you end up in a situation where communication very easily can break down because it's not obvious who should be responsible for that communication. No fun anecdote here. I guess 2 lessons. Lesson 1 is be aware of the biases that you're picking up from the people immediately around you, because you as a leader need to be responsible for understanding the entire situation. And proximity can really strongly influence your interpretation of what's going on. And secondly, I'll just put it down formally, is that person can be remote, team can be remote, people can't be remote. But yeah, definitely not the high point of my leadership on Anthem. I was the person in charge of the entire project. It's my responsibility to ensure that there is a functional relationship between all of the people involved on the project. And I let myself fall into bad habits and not be aware of my own biases. And it certainly didn't help the team become more unified. It's worth talking about the core leadership team of Anthem a little bit more deeply. This was the team that made Mass Effect. Mass Effect 1, 2, and 3. They've been together a really long time. They have a particular way of working together. And for most of that time, they worked for and with Casey Hudson. This is a team that knew how to make single-player action RPG storytelling games. And when you look at some of the things that are wrong with Anthem, they come from a misunderstanding about multiplayer games and live service games versus single player storytelling games. The way that storytelling is structured in Anthem doesn't understand that there are other people along with you that can mess up the storytelling. The economy doesn't take into account that it needs to be able to last for a very long time. That balance matters in a live service game a lot more than it matters in a single player game. And these things were eventually uncovered, but because in classic BioWare style, the game was only coming together in the last few months, they weren't obvious in the code until it was often much too late to fix it. There were people, most of whom were in Austin, who were screaming into the darkness that we needed to think about things like the economy, things like the ed game, well before it was too late. But because the leadership had become dysfunctional, because these communication channels have been damaged between Edmonton and Austin, that wasn't really being heard. The second lesson here, maybe a little bit less obvious than single player and multiplayer are not the same thing, is one about the transferability of skill sets, transferability of expertise. This was a leadership team who had been together for a very long time, and they had ways of working together, and they thought they knew how to make games. And arguably, they did know how to make games. They made Mass Effect 2, BioWare's highest rated game of all time. And the people who were making design decisions played multiplayer games, played games with long tails, games like Diablo, games like Destiny, but they had never made those games. And I think to some degree what was happening was that there was a conflation of expertise in game making, which they had, and understanding of games they had played, which they had, into a belief in an expertise in game making for a kind of game they had never made, but had played. Playing a game is certainly an excellent way to learn about how games are made, but it isn't everything, because it doesn't help you understand how difficult something was to make. You only get to see the end result. You may draw conclusions about the ways that things interact with each other that may be right in the instance that you're experiencing in the game that you're playing, but may not be broadly applicable. May have arisen through massive iteration, may have arisen through design processes that you are unaware of. If you're coming in trying to replicate something that you have played, and you understand you don't really know exactly how they did it, that acknowledgement of your ignorance of the development process is going to help you give yourself enough time to respect the complexity of these features that you're seeing. On the other hand, if you come in believing you understand how it works, thinking you have it all figured out, thinking that it's easier than the things that you have done in the past, that can really trap you in this place where you end up deprioritizing the systems you don't understand because you've convinced yourself they will be very simple and can wait to be implemented later. And then when it turns out you find yourself in a place where actually they're way more complicated than you gave them credit for, you haven't given yourself enough time to do things right. When you're taking over another project, it's very difficult to gather the information that you are probably going to need to understand what's going on, especially if you are someone who does a lot of synthesis like I do. I tend to gather a lot of my information relatively organically by observing what is going on around the edges. Anthem was a big project and it had been running for a lot of time, so there was a lot of knowledge within the team that wasn't necessarily written down. So when someone like me or like Benoit is coming onto the project, they have to make assumptions as to how things are working or how things are structured, unless there is something that is obviously different and they can ask a question about that and then dig in that area. If it isn't immediately obvious that things are different, it isn't going to be obvious that this needs to be questioned. Now, it might be possible to make a checklist of all the questions you need to ask when you take over a project, but that would be a document 600 pages long, and it would take you longer to work your way through than the remaining time on a project. So you're going to have to make some assumptions. But I think what you also need to do is come in with the knowledge that you are making those assumptions and be almost extra sensitive to any information that would indicate that one of your assumptions is being violated. I'm not sure if I can really crystallize that into an action, but let me give you an example. Anthem massively underspent on tools. On Morrison, there was an effort made to figure out what the state of tools was on Anthem because the decision had been made that Morrison was going to converge on Anthem's tech stack, so it was worth the time to figure out what was there. You have to remember, as illogical as this may sound, Dragon Age Inquisition, Mass Effect Andromeda, and Anthem, while all three were on Frostbite, they had built their own tech stacks to a large degree. The part of the technology that wasn't included in Frostbite had basically been rebuilt 3 times, which to me is complete insanity, but that's what happened. When the effort on Morrison was done to dig in on the state of tools, what it found was that Anthem had massively underspent on tools. I'm going to quote some numbers, and I'm not sure I'm remembering these exactly right, but what I think was the case was that Dragon Age Inquisition spent about 30% of its tech budget, so its programming budget, on tools. Andromeda spent significantly less at about 20%. And then Anthem only spent about 5% of its technology budget on tools. And that is a big difference. And that had massive ramifications on the development of the project. Why did it spend so little? I don't know the answer to that question. But when I'm coming in with the assumption that we are working with a relatively established tools base, my expectations on the speed of things, the agility of things, our ability to do different things is way out of whack. As it turns out, Anthem was very rigid. And in some places like UI, it was orders of magnitude slower than what you would expect a team to be able to do because the underlying tools were simply not there. Or if they were there, they were incomplete. Or they were deprioritized in preference to working on something else. What you had was a UI team that was very, very slow. Not because they weren't working, not because they weren't good at their jobs, but because they were struggling with an incomplete tool set that wasn't supporting them adequately at all. Now we're getting into 2018 when I finally realized that this was what was going on because my assumption was being violated. Finally, I realized that my expectation for the velocity of the UI team was being violated. It took me much longer than it should have. And we brought the team together and talked to them about why is things taking so long? And it was a revelation to me to realize the conditions under which they were working. And you might be thinking, well, why didn't they raise this problem? And the answer to that is something that's called learned helplessness. The short answer is they did raise this concern, but they'd raised it earlier, and either they were given an answer that this would be addressed eventually, and then it never was, or they were told there wasn't time and they just had to do their best, or whatever. They were taught over months and months and months and months that if they asked for help, they weren't going to get it. So they stopped asking. So when I came onto the project, they were already in this state of struggling with a system that effectively made their work virtually impossible, but they were suffering in silence. When I talk about being sensitive to places where your expectations or assumptions are being violated, this is exactly what I'm talking about. This was a team that from the outside, if you weren't looking very closely, looked like they didn't have any problems because they weren't complaining. There were some issues about delivery, but again, that isn't always obvious at first because schedules get manipulated or massaged to represent what's happening as opposed to the reality underneath. It's easy enough to explain why this screen didn't get to white box if the design is changing underneath it. So there were lots of externalities that made it easy to rationalize away their low velocity. But the reality is the team was in a really bad place, and it took me a very long time to figure that out. And effectively, unfortunately, by the time we did figure it out, it kind of was too late to do anything about it. Try to remember that learned helplessness is a thing, that no news isn't necessarily good news. Sometimes a team will just learn to shut up, and you need to be on the lookout for that, especially when you are coming into a culture that you don't understand. In a healthy culture that you are immersed in, you are going to be more sensitive to these things. And hopefully your culture is healthy enough that you are stopping learned helplessness from happening in the first place. But if you are coming into another culture, a new culture, your assumptions of culture, your assumptions of structure are going to blind you to some things that maybe are discoverable that otherwise you might not be able to find. I guess a second lesson, hopefully this one is fairly obvious, is you should probably spend more on tools than you think you should be, especially if you're making a game with a ton of content. If you're making a game that is mostly handcrafted technology, then maybe you don't need a ton of tools work. But most of the games I've worked on have been dominated by the amount of content they've had. And the ones that have had good tools have definitely had a much easier time than the ones that didn't have good tools. We should talk about flying in Anthem. Flying in Anthem is amazing. It feels great every single time. It feels like you are throwing yourself into the void and then catching yourself before you fall to your death. It feels good. It lets you move around the world. It lets you explore this really large, really interesting space in a really cool way. But there are a lot of problems with flying. Not with the feature itself, but with the way that it impacts everything else in the game. If I can fly, then I move over the terrain really quickly. I consume level art at an incredibly accelerated pace. If I can fly, then creatures that are stuck on the ground can only reach me with ranged weapons. Maybe I don't want all the creatures to have ranged weapons. If I can fly, then the environmental design of the combat arenas becomes a lot less important because I can pop up over cover, and if the enemies can fly, they can do the same. So that cover matters a lot less. The environmental design of combat matters a lot less. If I can fly, then having other entities follow me through the world becomes a lot more difficult because we move from a 2.25D or 2.5D pathfinding space into a true 3D space. If I can fly and it's a multiplayer game, it can be really hard to keep your party together because we can go off in every single direction. And because we're a multiplayer game, that can become a big problem because it's going to impact the amount of world we need to have streamed in, because your party of 4 could be in 4 totally different places. And you are going to have to keep all of that world in memory all at the same time. And this is ultimately why flying went through this weird on again, off again relationship on Anthem. The team was having a lot of difficulty figuring out how to design combats with flight in place. So the decision made by the creative director was to remove it to try to encourage them to design combat in some environment, with the idea being that once they figured that out, they could then be re-added. The problem is this isn't really the best way to approach a problem like that. The reason why the environment that was originally built for E3 2017 was flat, was the farm, was because it was built when combat was removed. But if you actually look at the way that encounters and storytelling and the like is done in Anthem, it's done through a lens that essentially assumes that flying doesn't really exist. Additionally, the game doesn't really take full advantage of flight. There isn't a lot of gameplay that assumes you're flying. There isn't a lot of gameplay that interacts with the mechanism of the way flight works in Anthem in order to integrate it fully into the rest of the gameplay. So not only is it causing consequences in the way that other things are working, other things aren't pushing back, aren't causing their own consequence, intentionally integrating and weaving it into the overall structure of the gameplay as a whole. I think flying is Anthem's best feature, but I think you can also argue that in a lot of ways, it's Anthem's worst feature, because the consequences of flying aren't adequately taken into account in the game design. The game isn't integrating flight adequately into the creation and design of the other parts of the game around it. So when we are adding very innovative things into our games, that's awesome. That's something that we should be trying to do because that's how the industry pushes itself forward. But when we're doing that, we have to be prepared to commit to the amount of work that is required in order to adapt the other features that we're keeping to this new innovation. We can't build a game without flight, build systems without flight, and then add flight on top, because those systems aren't going to properly take flight into account. And flight is the place where this happens on Anthem, but you see this in other games that add brand new, interesting features. This is that often they maintain status quo on the features that aren't this new innovation, and sometimes that doesn't work. This isn't to say we shouldn't try new things. This isn't to say that we can't introduce a new feature that is going to become our best feature, but innovation does have consequence. We need to consider that as we are innovating. Consider the knock-on effects as this feature impacts the other features in the game. Another way to go, and this is the way I think that the Monster Hunter team acts, is to introduce our innovation from the edges and then integrate it more and more deeply into the game over subsequent innovations. One of the advantages of doing it this way is it lets us be incredibly experimental, try really crazy things, but isolate them to a large degree from the overall game experience. But then if they are enjoyable, if they are successful, we can move them ever closer to the center of the gameplay experience. But this requires you to have a much longer term thought process, a plan where you are assuming that features are going to exist across multiple games, are going to be iterated on and more fully integrated or potentially discarded from game to game to game. A lot of studios don't have that kind of time horizon, so they are having to introduce new features very close to the center of the experience because this might be the only shot they get, or the next game might be 6 years further out. If you know that you're going to get another one, or you can at least assume you're going to get another one, it gives you another potential way to introduce innovation, having it slowly migrate its way from the outside of the experience into the center. When we are making a multiplayer game, we have to think about the ownership of the different parts of what's going on. When I'm experiencing story, whose story is it? Am I experiencing it just for me? Are we all experiencing the same story at the same time? Am I experiencing your story? This also applies to my character, my equipment, and the world as a whole. Casey's vision for Dylan, this perfectly crafted EA bit of candy, the answer to almost all of those questions was our, where our was defined as a small group of people. There's a lot of conjecture in what I'm about to say, but this is how I think it was supposed to work. In part, this conjecture exists because I'm essentially reverse engineering from a couple of pitch decks. Like I said before, a lot of this design either didn't exist at all, or it left BioWare with Casey when he left. The equipment is ours. I can climb. We share a collection of javelins, and we can upgrade and climb into any javelin we want and then go out together. The story is progressing based on all of our experiences. If I play at a time when you don't play and push the story forward, then the story is pushed forward for all of us. And in the case of the world, I think the intention was that our would be even broader, that the world would be shared commonly amongst the entirety of the community. But once Casey was gone, the answers to these questions kind of got lost. They basically weren't really being asked. And there are some answers that are relatively obvious in Anthem, and the default answer was an adequate answer. Who owns my character? It's me. Who owns my javelin? It's me. Who owns the world? By the time the game shipped, we moved to a place where the answer to that was effectively me, but we also pushed to a more static world as a result of that, because there was concern that if you had two different characters whose world state was in very different places, that it'd be confusing for them to be in visually different spaces at the same time, standing right beside each other. Is that the right answer? Probably not, but that's where we basically landed. The place where the default answer really messed up Anthem is in storytelling. The default answer is essentially ours. We are in a mission together, we are experiencing story, and we are triggering the beats as we trigger the beats. We're all the main character, so whoever gets to the story beat triggers the story beat, and everyone else gets it in a secondary way. But the narrative is structured as if it's a single-player game, as if you are going to get a series of beats in order. At the macroscopic level, this is effectively how it works. I can only consume the missions that I've either already done or the next mission in my story progression. So at the macroscopic level, the storytelling, essentially, it is mine. I am experiencing, as I am moving through the story, I am experiencing the missions in a way that is telling the story to me as if I am the protagonist. But within the missions, the answer ends up defaulting to an answer that is a lot closer to our. And this resulted in what we were calling shitty mentor. If I play a mission with somebody who has already played the mission, they can actually render my experience of that storytelling really bad because the story beats trigger as people reach them. And as a result, what can happen is we reach a story beat and we trigger that storytelling. And then while whatever is happening at that beat is still occurring, that person who knows what's going to happen next leaves and starts to go to the next beat. And then at the first possible instance that they trigger the next beat. So we might be in a defend beat and we're defending this point. And then the instant that we've reached the point where that is complete, they trigger the next beat and everyone else is way out of position. The pacing is thrown completely into disarray. Indeed, you can make it even worse than that. If you are in a mission with just two people that are trying to be shitty mentors, they can drag you through the mission so quickly that you hit a beat and they go to the next two beats and trigger them in quick succession, and the storytelling is just like tumbling all over itself. So flying is definitely not helping this in the case of Anthem. If you didn't have flying, it would be a lot easier to slow the party down, to keep them together, to put up obstacles. But you can only lock the entire party down in so many ways in a game with flight before it starts to feel really artificial. So Anthem is left with this pacing problem where People who are playing these missions to grind for gear are encouraged to play them as quickly and efficiently as possible. Whereas people who are experiencing them for the first time, you want them to play at a totally different pace. And those two reward structures are actively at odds with each other. And so not only is it possible to get into this shitty mentor situation, it's actually likely to happen because people are likely to want to play the missions as quickly as they can in order to grind the gear. And then to lay on top of a lack of consideration of who owns what and flight, you also have the client server architecture actively discouraging the player from playing by themselves. So they are strongly encouraged to play with another group, and to some degree, a group of random people. So all of this is conspiring to undermine the storytelling in Anthem. But ultimately, it just comes back to the fact that ownership of the various parts of the game in a multiplayer context wasn't adequately considered. If you look at a game like Borderlands, it's considering this to a greater degree. If the party starts to break apart, the storytelling spreads amongst all of the other people. If you look at a game like Final Fantasy XIII, it's really trying to make the story be mine. When I am doing a mission, the game is treating me as if I am the protagonist. And everyone else that I bring along with me is coming along for the ride. Now, they might be having that exact same experience from their perspective. So it's me for everyone. But the advantage of that is you're able to tailor the storytelling to each person based upon what they're experiencing. Whereas this accidental hour that Anthem ends up with means that the game is treating everyone as if they are the same protagonist. It is certainly possible to do hour for storytelling. It can be done, but it needs to be done with intentionality. If you aren't taking this into account, you're going to end up with these bad edge cases. And then if your economy is encouraging certain repeat behaviors, edge cases can very easily become standard cases, which is what I would argue is what's happening with Anthem and its storytelling. If you're making a multiplayer game, consider when I'm in a story, whose story is it? When I'm in a world, whose world is it? When I have a piece of gear, whose gear is it? When I have a character, whose character is it? Is it mine? Is it ours? Is it yours? Am I coming into your game? Is it the community's? Or is it just a static thing? Each of these possible answers can result in really interesting gameplay. But if you don't ask the question, you're going to end up with an accidental answer. And in the case of multiplayer experiences, accidental answers is exactly what you don't want to end up happening. For the longest time, Anthem only had one kind of javelin, and it was the Ranger, the middle-of-the-road javelin. There is a lot to be said for starting with your middle case, because it allows you to explore the space without a lot of restriction. The danger is that what can happen is you introduce features that are fun, dodging or shields or whatever, and then as you try to build your more extreme cases, you can end up finding yourself in a situation where you have to take fun features away from the middle case in order to differentiate the more extreme cases. If you can build from the edges in, then you're starting at the edges and you're defining the outside edges of your space, and they're able to move in towards the middle. If you imagine starting with the Storm, the javelin that can hover and has shields and is very elementally, almost magic focused, and the Colossus, which is this heavy, barely capable of flight, has armor, is really tough, and then averaging those out towards the middle, you can kind of see how that could work. But doing that can be very difficult to do because if you think of the Colossus and the Storm as your starting points, they don't actually share a ton of things in common. I'm not recommending that you don't start from the middle and work your way outwards, but at some point you need to start to define the ways that your edges are different from each other, that your edges are different from the middle. So if you stick with the middle too long, it can become an anchor. it can start to be very difficult to make those more exceptional cases around the edges, because it can become very hard to take things away from that middle case. And if you aren't careful, and this happened on Anthem, you can end up with a middle case that is good at everything. And you don't want to take any of those features away. And then you end up with your edge cases being just worse. And then in an effort to try to fix that, you may overcorrect and underpower your middle case. So ideally, the way to go is probably to start with the middle case, use it to anchor the average case of your experience, and then go out to the edges and then come back, and then go out and then come back. So you're understanding your edges, you're understanding that differentiation, you're putting a few lines in the sand that keep your design separate, and you don't end up with a overpowered center case, or in response to that, an underpowered center case. One of the big things that we did for Anthem at E3 2018 was this Q&A at the primary EA press conference. I guess worth mentioning that it wasn't actually at E3, it was at EA Play, the not E3 that happened in Hollywood instead of downtown Los Angeles that EA ran out of a parking lot. But in any event, EA had gotten a lot of feedback that their press conferences were too slick, too polished, too fake. And they were really trying to bring authenticity back into the press conference. You can see a very early video I made on this channel about how you can't practice authenticity. And yeah, this is exactly the moment that is in reference to. A lot of EA lives in this perpetual state of fear. They don't want to get blamed for things. So in the case of media, one of the ways they try to mitigate that is by rehearsals. Rehearsals, millions of rehearsals. Rehearsals for internal presentations. Rehearsals out the wazoo. As you would imagine, if you have what is intended to be a casual Q&A session between an interviewer and myself and Casey and Kathleen, and then you practice the living shit out of it, you're going to squeeze all that authenticity out of what then occurs. I've talked about trying to win versus trying not to lose. If you have an organization where a bunch of your people live in fear of doing something wrong, live in fear of getting in trouble, they are trying not to lose. If you are trying to fake authenticity, but because you're afraid of what authentic might actually look like, and so you practice all the authenticity out of it, you are trying not to lose. The end result is fine, but you don't get the spontaneity, you don't get the emotion, you don't get the enthusiasm that you would get from having that Q&A naturally occur and having the answers come out that come out. And yes, you run the risk that someone is going to say something insane that you're then going to have to deal with. But by avoiding that, you're also squeezing out all of the excitement from the event. That's not to say you want to have Peter Molyneux inventing features on stage, but by being afraid of that happening and correcting for that so aggressively, you are putting yourself in a situation where what you were wanting to happen is exactly not what you're going to get. So in 2018, we have made the decision again that the game is going to be client server, that it's going to have dedicated servers that will run the game logic for the game. As part of this, I guess the last dying argument from the people pushing for peer-to-peer is this mathematic exercise that basically says something to the effect of, if everyone plays this game single player, we're still paying for a server for each of those people, and it's going to be very expensive. And that's true. Now, since launch, Austin has done a massive amount of work and massively optimized the servers for Anthem, bringing their costs down a lot. But at this point, those servers are pretty expensive. They're basically almost as expensive as running the game itself. If you are running these dedicated servers on hardware you're paying Amazon for, you want those costs to be as low as possible. You don't want to be running 1 or 2 instances of your server on the server architecture. You want to be running 20. And in 2018, the number is a lot closer to 2 than it is to 20. So it's a legitimate argument, a legitimate concern. And so what we don't want to mandate that you play with other people. There are a lot of reasons why you want to give people the ability to play on their own, that you don't want to force social interactions that are potentially quite toxic onto people playing your game. But what we did do, and this is 100% on me, it was to put a dark pattern into the launching of missions. If you try to launch a mission in Anthem and you don't have a full party, it doesn't ask you if you're sure that you want to launch with an incomplete party. It asks you the opposite question. It asks you if you want to wait and fill out your party. So it makes it very easy to confusingly, instead of launching by yourself, group up with other people. Did it make a difference in the number of servers that were run with only one person in them? Probably to a minor extent. Did it make the game slightly annoying to every single person who tried? Yeah, absolutely. I think the lesson here is that it can be very tempting to consider the catastrophe scenario, the what will happen if every single person does this thing that is non-optimal. But that's not actually going to occur. So planning around what could happen as opposed to what will happen can result in you making decisions that are actually going to worsen the actual experience of your players. Interestingly, almost this exact argument was made about Mass Effect multiplayer because they were worried that the matching servers or something like that was going to bankrupt EA if enough people tried to connect to it at the same time. I don't remember the specifics of that. So it's important to consider the fact that your servers have cost and to try to optimize for that. It's important to encourage people to group up, but there's a point at which you are optimizing for an unlikely or virtually unfathomable situation to the detriment of the actual average experience. Pretty much starting with E3 of 2018 and going all the way through launch, I was effectively acting like a second social media manager. I answered a massive number of questions on Twitter. I was very active in interacting with the community. And honestly, I think this is a good thing. One of the things that I could do that a social media manager couldn't was provide very accurate, very quick responses to questions that were churning around in the community. Large corporations, and EA is honestly probably the poster child for this, like to have very controlled social media presences. They want their messages to be vetted. They want to make sure that they don't say the wrong things. And there is an argument to this, but the problem of doing that is it really slows down your communication. If you want the audience to be excited, if you want your players to be really engaged in the process, you want that volume of communication to be as high as you can manage. So if you are in a world with this very constrained, very formalized social media apparatus, one of the only ways to get around that is to have someone very senior within the studio organization, the person in charge of the project, or someone very close to the person in charge of the project, who is able to circumvent that process. I definitely would recommend it in those worlds. It is going to be a source of tension between you and the larger organization because they recognize that they can't really stop you, but they also don't want you to be doing it. So that becomes a point of friction. But for the most part, EA recognized the benefit that it provided, even if they were uncomfortable with the process. I don't think that BioWare has learned this lesson. I think that they have reverted to a very corporate, very low information style of interaction with their community, much to their own detriment in recent years. I'm not going to put anyone on blast here, but a common gotcha for me specifically on Anthem is people who in 2018 would tweet at me saying, why is BioWare even making this game? It is not in BioWare's wheelhouse. And my response to that was always something to the effect of, BioWare games are whatever BioWare is currently making, and the studio can change and can try other things. And then after the game came out, people would come out of the woodwork and say, see, 2 years ago, I told you this wasn't going to work and it didn't work. So I guess I'll pull the curtain back a little bit here and explain what's going on, which isn't really a lesson for me, but maybe it can be a lesson for some of you. If someone is acting as an official representative of the studio that they're working for, then you can expect that whatever communication you are having with them through whatever outlet or media that you are going through is going to be curated to some degree. In my case, I strongly believe in as little curation as possible, but what that means isn't that I'm telling you every single thing that I'm thinking. It just means that rather than going through the entirety of the PR department at the corporation, I'm doing that curation myself. So if you tell me that this seems like too big of a deviation from what BioWare has historically doing, why is it doing it? I'm not going to publicly agree with you, regardless of my actual thoughts on the matter, because that's going to work against the game that I am working on. It doesn't matter what my thoughts are at this point in time. What matters is this is the reality of the situation. This is the game that is being made. I need to explain why that makes sense, because it's what's happening. It does me no favors, it does me no good to say negative things about the game that I am actively working on. Of course, I am going to support it. Of course, I am going to rationalize the actions that we are taking, even if behind closed doors, I am vehemently opposed to them, because the reality is the reality, and I'm going to be trying to make the best of the situation that we find ourselves in. So it's not the gotcha that you think it is to point at a tweet from 3 years before the game came out where I disagree with your point and then say, see, I was right all along. Because maybe I was disagreeing with you because I disagreed with you. Maybe I was publicly disagreeing with you because privately I 100% agreed with you, but I didn't have a choice in the matter. Something that has been changing significantly since I got on Twitter in 2011 is the number of people on the dev team who are being drawn into the discourse around a game. It used to be that it would basically be the person in charge of the project and maybe the design director, the GM of the studio, and that would basically be it. But more and more, you are seeing other people getting caught up in these conversations. For the most part, it's not because those people are changing their activities on social media. They were posting stuff in 2011 and 2012. They were voicing their opinions, but to a large degree, those opinions were staying within their very small social groups. Since 2011, we've moved from a world where social media posts moved largely through retweets and seeing things directly posted by your followers into a world where these things are driven much more by algorithms, which means that if you are a minor dev on a project and you say something controversial, in the past, that controversial statement would largely stay within the circle of people that you normally have a conversation with. Maybe it gets retweeted, maybe it goes wider, but it's very difficult for something like that to go hyper viral. These days, if you say that controversial statement, there's a reasonable chance that the algorithm is going to figure out that this is something that can drive traffic, and that post is going to get spread super wide. And to a lot of people, you probably didn't really want to see it. The problem is that other than the very senior people on a project, most of the members of a dev team don't have media training at all, and they certainly don't have social media training. So they're not well equipped to enter into a situation where they find themselves the main character of the internet for a day. Most people, including most people watching this video, probably have their profiles on their social media platforms public. Because for the most part, it doesn't really matter. And there's an opportunity for you to get a little bit of fame once in a while when you post something particularly clever. But for people who publicly work in media, it's worth considering if this is what you want. Because if you are publicly presenting yourself as working for a media company, be it on a movie or for a video game company, and you are also posting things about that game or posting things that are political or have a social bent, then you are conflating those two things. And the discourse around the media that you're working and the social media things that you are posting that you may not think have anything to do with that game or that movie are going to get conflated together. And you are probably not equipped to deal with that. And to be frank, the studio, the publisher, the corporation, they don't really want your political views, your social views out in the world becoming a topic of conversation for the game as a whole. EA doesn't seem to have figured out how to deal with this. Based upon their actions, they seem to have decided that they can't tell people not to post on social media. They seem to have decided they can't tell people not to make the fact that they are working on a particular game public, but they don't really want it to be that way. I will probably try to make a video about this topic specifically at a future date, but for now, to keep it on the topic of Anthem, notice that the number of people at BioWare involved in the discourse about Anthem was very, very small. It was me, the social media manager, and basically that was it. Whereas the number of people involved in the discourse around something like Dragon Age the Veilguard, massively larger. It's not because those devs weren't on social media in 2018. It's because the reality of the social media landscape has changed dramatically in the last 7 years. Throughout 2018, as the game is finally starting to turn into something, one thing that's increasingly clear is that this is a game with storytelling done in a different way than is traditional in a BioWare game. There are no followers, effectively, at least no followers that are with you all the time. It's very strongly mission-based. You redo missions in order to grind gear. So in a lot of ways, it doesn't look like what a traditional BioWare game looks like from a storytelling perspective. Both Casey and I come to the same conclusion, which is that we need to make this clear to potential players, because our worry is that we're going to bring in traditional BioWare players who are then going to be angry at what they get, and that is going to serve as the kernel of a negative backlash against the game. So both Casey and I are very clear in the public that this is not a traditional BioWare game. This is not storytelling like you're used to. Make sure you come in with your eyes open. Honestly, I feel like we overdid it. For me, I had the experience on Sonic Chronicles where we didn't adequately communicate that this was a simpler RPG. And so there was some degree of negative backlash against it being simpler. People who were expecting a Baldur's Gate or a Jade Empire and were getting something that was targeting a younger audience and with simpler mechanics were disappointed by that. And I felt, yes, we should have communicated that more clearly, and it affected the perception of the game negatively. Not entirely sure where Casey's motivation was coming from, but the same idea. Let's be clear. But the reality is when you look at the game now and step outside of it, in a lot of ways, it still does have a BioWare story. It is simpler, it is streamlined, but it's still in there. By over-communicating how it was not like a BioWare game, I think we ultimately did damage to the perception of the game, because the traditional BioWare player didn't play the game. They said, oh, okay, well, they've made it very clear this is not a game for me. I'm not going to play the game. And what we didn't understand was that there was negative perception to be had within the audience that we were now focused on, this looter shooter audience. If instead the game had been positioned sort of more between those two audiences, I think it would have helped its perception. I think mixed into the conversation would have been something to the effect of, while this isn't the best BioWare story, I still got enjoyment from that narrative experience. While this isn't as effective of a looter shooter as Destiny, the combination of the looter shooter and the narrative experience is an experience that I'm enjoying. Does it take the Metacritic from the 50s to the 80s? No, I don't think so, but you can imagine it pushing that perception, pushing the experience of the public up a little bit as you both bring in some of the audience that you set aside on purpose who have a slightly more positive experience, but also as you shift expectations into something a little bit more apart from the very competitive genre that Anthem found itself in. And I've talked about this in previous videos, but different genres have different expectations of execution. RPGs, in a lot of ways, while being very hard games to make, get a lot of leeway in the way that people critique them. Because you are playing an RPG typically for newness. It's a new story. Often you're looking for an exploration of new mechanics or a new setting or new art or all of those things together. Whereas other genres like shooters, or in this case looter shooters, there is a much higher expectation of fidelity of execution. A competently executed but deeply flawed RPG usually ends up landing in the 70s. Whereas a competently executed looter shooter, even one that doesn't really have any flaws, will often land in the 50s or 60s because people aren't looking for competence. They're looking for the top end of performance. They're not looking for novelty. They're looking for the features that they expect in a game to be there at the highest level of execution. And at the end of the day, that's simply not where Anthem is. It's competently executed, but it isn't firing on all cylinders really anywhere other than flight, which isn't an expectation of the genre. So as an RPG, that would be probably seen as a really good game. Whereas as a looter shooter, that's seen as unacceptable. The more systems driven you are, the more that high level of execution is going to be expected. In the more content driven genres, there's a greater emphasis placed on novelty. Would shifting Anthem out of looter shooter and towards RPG have helped it? I think it would have. Does it make a game of the year? Absolutely not. But it would have helped the way that it sat in the marketplace. Now, I don't know that simply Casey and I positioning it a little bit different is enough to get it there. It's still a live service. It's still presenting itself as a live service. It probably needs more than simply a more nuanced conversation with the potential fan base. But we certainly didn't help matters by the way that we talked about storytelling in the game. Arguably, this all goes back to this identity crisis that Anthem has had for a lot of its existence, starting in 2014 when Casey leaves and never really being fully resolved. Because it was unwilling to call itself a looter shooter to itself, it was not always focused on getting those looter shooter features really locked down. But because it was also knowing that it was something new for storytelling, it wasn't focused on making sure it locked down its base level storytelling either. So when Casey and I are trying to position it in the marketplace, we are leaning away from traditional BioWare labels, but we haven't adequately made sure that the game is checking all the checkboxes of the looter shooter genre, which is what we end up in by default as we move away from a different genre. By positioning between the two genres, you might have just fallen like a thud and gotten the worst attention from both spaces, but you might have been able to get a little bit of grace from either side. I guess we never will know what would have actually happened if both the project had had a cleaner sense of self-identity and also the game had been positioned in a slightly different way. I've definitely worked on projects that had features that had really important features come into being incredibly late in development. Even features that are very core to the experience. The war table for Dragon Age Inquisition is an invention very late in the process of development. But possibly the largest late feature that I've ever been involved in is the hangar for Anthem. If you haven't played Anthem, the hangar is a place where you hang out with a bunch of other people in a lobby in your suit so that you can find groups, gather together, hang out, and then go out on missions. This kind of social space is essentially a necessity for a looter shooter. But Anthem didn't have one. The intention was always that when you left a mission, you were going to go back into the single player space and then go back out and regroup each time. Which in retrospect, it makes no sense. But it wasn't until very late in 2018 that this was basically obviously missing from the game. At the end of the day, we actually worked with Montreal. Many of the people who had been BioWare employees up until 2017 to get this thing made. And they arguably pulled a miracle out of their hat to make this thing even exist, because they were getting more people into a space than we had ever done before by a lot. They had to have a space that could load very quickly and a space that allowed you to go back out into the world as quickly as possible. I guess the lesson here is that if you need the feature, you need the feature, and it doesn't really matter how late it is if you need it. You're just gonna have to suck it up and find a way to get it done, which is exactly what happened with the hangar. And I guess thank you again to the people in Montreal that made that feature happen, because without it, Anthem is even more incomplete at launch. It can be very easy to convince yourself that you don't really need the feature, that you can live without it, that you don't have time to do it. But on most projects, there's going to be at least one feature where that's not the case, where no, you actually do need it. You actually do need to eat it. You need to find a way to make it happen. That's the hangar in Anthem. Arguably, I would say for Dragon Age the Veilguard, that's the keep. That's the feature that they should have found a way to support. But they didn't. They talked themselves out of it. And in the end, it really hurt them. Originally, loot in Anthem was supposed to be a 3-step process. And I think I might be getting the order of these mixed up a little bit, but I think it was supposed to work like this. When a piece of loot dropped, you would know what it was. It's a gun, it's a thruster, whatever. When you then walked over and picked it up, you would get information about its rarity. It's rare or common or legendary. And then only when you went back to Fort Tarsis would you then be able to reveal what the actual piece of loot was. This was intentionally designed into the system. The thinking was to try to give the player 3 distinct dopamine hits from the process of the loot. The problem is that it didn't really accomplish that, because each of those steps, except for that last one, wasn't really enough information for you to get excited about. Because you need enough information to start to theory craft your build, knowing that it's a gun isn't really very exciting at all. Knowing that it's a rare gun maybe is exciting, but what if it is completely useless for your existing build? That makes it less exciting. And it's only once you know everything that you're able to start the process of doing something about it. But because this was intentional design for a really long time, the game wasn't designed to be able to let you go into your inventory and even look at your loadout while you're out in the field. This wasn't just not implemented, it was actually not possible because there wasn't enough memory to actually load that UI screen, which included 3D elements, while you're out in the world. It's worth remembering that when you are playing a game that isn't an RPG, and you're wondering why they're able to sometimes do things that RPGs can't. One of the answers to that is sometimes because of all the things they aren't doing. A game needs to keep the resources around to load all the UIs that it might need. And if one of those UIs is a very expensive UI, which typically inventory screens are because they involve scenes with 3D elements and lighting all on their own, if that's a screen you need to be able to load, you are drawing away resources that would otherwise be available to the game as a whole. You can design around that. You can stream things in and out, but as is always the case, anytime you do something that involves additional work, you are pulling work away from somewhere else. In the case of Anthem, because the loops weren't closed until pretty late, it wasn't really obvious that this was going to be a big problem. A lot of bridges were burned on assumptions that proved to be false. I guess the lesson, and a lesson that has been consistent throughout my channel, is that you want to close these loops as soon as you can. That's how you're going to realize that things aren't actually working the way you are imagining them to work. Ultimately, this is the same thing that happened with the Hangar. There were people who were very familiar with live service games who could communicate that we're going to need this thing. But until the loops were closed and it was demonstrated to people in decision-making positions, it wasn't really possible for that to be fully agreed to. So close your loops so that you can challenge your own assumptions in a more complete way. By September, October of 2018, we kind of all know that this game is coming in on fire, really hot. And part of this, the process of this, is that the leader who controlled the umbrella under which BioWare fell shifted our target for Anthem. We didn't really have a Metacritic target before, but now it was very clearly being stated that we were targeting a game in the 70s. Historically, BioWare games always had a target of 90, of being in the 90s. And there are a lot of reasons why a Metacritic target above 90 is really troublesome. It can actually be really hard to achieve, and in some cases, it's beyond your control. If I make a great game and I get 3 reviews, 2 95s, and 1 75, that single 75 is enough to drag me down out of the 90s. There's just not a lot of room up there. So unless you get a ton of 10 out of 10s, holding your score above 90 is really hard to do. Additionally, most review sites don't have a 100-point score, so they can't give a game they don't think is perfect an 88. They might have a 4-point score, in which case, if they don't think it's perfect, all they can do is either give it a 4 out of 4 or give it a 3 out of 4. Now, a lot of the sites have fractional scores, so they're really out of 8, but whatever. But again, the reality is there's just not a lot of room to play with. If, on the other hand, you're targeting an 80, if you can get a few 10 out of 10s, you can handle a lot more variety in your scores and still stay above an 8. If you get a single 10 out of 10, that counteracts a 6 out of 10. And sometimes for certain genres, for certain kinds of games, they're going to see a very wide spread of review scores because they're trying something new, because their quality is inconsistent and different sites are going to review them to different levels through different rubrics. So mathematically, targeting an 8 is simply just a lot easier than targeting a 9. But historically, that was what BioWare was trying for, was they wanted their game to be in the 90s. But that's historically what BioWare targeted. Basically up until Ray and Greg left, that was the stated goal. We are targeting the 90s. One of the reasons why BioWare had such a reputation for its games being so late was that target. As we lived within EA, those targets softened. I don't remember a stated Metacritic target for Dragon Age Inquisition, but we started it under Ray and Greg, so we probably had at least a little bit of subconscious targeting the 90s running through our minds as we were working on it. But then within Andromeda, basically the target was, this game needs to come out. It needs to come out in this fiscal year. EA has data that shows that there is, if not necessarily a direct correlation between Metacritic and sales, at least some very clear cutoff points where games that score below a certain Metacritic will not sell above a certain number of units. Games like Call of Duty and Battlefield and that often have okay Metacritics and sell really well, but if you are bad, then you're not going to sell very well. Is it causal? Honestly, probably not, but it's still a good metric through which to say you need to be in the 70s at least, or you aren't going to sell very well. What I would argue is that targeting the 70s is actually really difficult. I did a video before about Metacritic specifically. If you're targeting above 90, you're basically saying we will do whatever it takes. We're accepting very little compromise. And of course, there is always compromise needed just to ship a game, but the amount of compromise you're willing to accept is very limited. If you're targeting just ship the thing, well, that's also actually relatively easy because the goal is simply be done. So you are willing to accept a wider range of flaws, a wider range of bugs. But the problem with targeting something in the 70s, especially with a genre that is so sensitive to the quality of some of its systems as opposed to the quality of its content, is it's hard to know where the line is. For an RPG, I think there's an argument to be made that you can kind of nudge it up a little bit, and move the quality from a 70 to a 75, to an 80, to an 85, to a 90, or at least most of that work is done in content. So when you polish an individual piece of content, it is going to make a very small impact on the overall Metacritic, which means when you compromise on that piece of polish, the impact to your Metacritic is also going to be relatively small. Whereas with something like a looter shooter, because okay isn't okay in a lot of cases, you're targeting a good enough loot system, a good enough progression system, and good enough mission structure. And if you're above that line, fine. That's going to get that system is an 80 or 90. But once you cross from good enough to almost good enough, you don't have a feature that's 75. You have a feature that's 45. And that's basically what's happening with Anthem. It has a bunch of features that are almost good enough, but they aren't good enough. And if it was an RPG, the story and the content would kind of glue the whole thing together into something. But because it's not an RPG, it's a looter shooter, a bunch of almost good enough systems is a 59% rated game. One last thing on Metacritic. I think this point is actually probably more relevant to Dragon Age of the Veilguard than to Anthem, but I'll say it here and hopefully remember to revisit it when we eventually get to that game. When you are making your game, one of the things you want to make sure is you're not making it impossible for anyone to give you a 10. What do I mean by that? What I mean is, if you have a game that is controversial, if you have a game that is going to have a wide range of review scores, one of the ways you balance out the 6s and the 5s is with 10s. But if someone who really likes your game is still encountering things that are going to stick in their craw that are going to prevent it from giving it a 10, then you aren't getting that many 10s. You're going to get 9.5s or 9s or 8.5s. And that 8.5 doesn't balance a 6 nearly as well as a 10 does. Like I said, I think this is more relevant to Dragon Age of the Veilguard. We'll talk about it at a future date, just to throw this onto the pile, as long as we're talking about Metacritic. So why in the world did Anthem put out a roadmap in late 2018? Well, the short answer is because it was being demanded from the potential player base. At this point in time, and I think still these days, for people who were big into this kind of live service experience, they wanted to know what they were going to get. They wanted to know that this was a game that was going to be supported long term. And one of the ways that was being used to signal that support was a roadmap, was something that said, okay, the game is going to come out and then here are the seasons, or here are the different content drops, or here are the different arenas that are going to come out over the course of a year. So you can be confident in buying the game because it's going to be supported. But even in 2018, the press was starting to push back on this, push back on selling a game on the promise of things that didn't even exist yet. And the reason why that was starting to happen is because you were seeing more and more games come out with a roadmap and then, for whatever reason, not follow through on that roadmap. Because that's the ultimate problem with a roadmap, is that it makes a promise that you are now either going to break or you're going to be tied into supporting. In some cases, the game may not be successful. So spending the money to fill out your roadmap just means that you are continuing to lose money. In some cases, the game comes out and it turns out it's broken. Either it's technically broken and you're spending your time just getting the thing into a technically stable space, or, as is arguably the case for Anthem, it is broken in its design. It has problems in its gameplay, it has problems in its balance, and you need to spend time tuning the game in order to get it to a place where a roadmap even makes sense. Is a roadmap a good idea? I don't think it is, but at the time in 2018, it was a virtual necessity for people who are interested in this kind of looter shooter live service long play game to pay attention at all. To be clear, I think the Anthem live support team did exactly what it should have done. It took a game that was having a lot of troubles and put its focus on fixing the game, as opposed to shoveling content into a hole of problems. And really, that's what you want, is you want focus to be put on the biggest issues and only to be looking at extending the game once you have the game in a good, solid, stable place. If you're making a live service, can you avoid having the roadmap come out before you launch the game? I would say that it's pretty difficult if this is your first game. There's going to be a lot of skepticism that you are going to be willing to support this game long term. But I do think that if this is a sequel or if this is a new live service and you have an existing track record, then you have an opportunity, if you have a good conversation going with your potential player base, to have a conversation that looks something like, we don't want to put out a roadmap. Our plan is to support this game for as long as we can, for a long term, as we have done with our previous live services. But by putting out a roadmap, we are making a promise that we may not be able to keep. We are going to do the right things for the game based upon what we see the game doing after it comes out. And rather than making a promise that we may not be able to keep, we would rather simply say that. We would rather simply commit to supporting the game for as long as it makes sense, doing the things that make sense to do the game to make the experience better and better for as many of our players as we can. But that requires a level of trust with your players that you may not have if this is your first live service game, that you may not have if you've abandoned a previous live service 3 months after it comes out. You may only be allowed to do that if you've actually had a live service that ran for a couple of years so that people can take your word for it. If you don't have that track record, in fact, if you have the opposite track record, you may need to make some promises. But the problem with making those promises is you might have to break those promises if that's what the game demands. At the end of 2018, I think it was December, it's possible that this was actually early 2019, January, but I'm pretty sure we are still in 2018. Casey and I are in a meeting with, let's say, very senior people within the EA organization. Casey and I are the only Bioware people there, but there are a bunch of other people from other parts of the grander organization. And this is a meeting about Anthem specifically. At this meeting, the most senior person in the call said, if you want me to still have a job, this game needs to come out before the end of the fiscal year. Fiscal year ends end of March 2019. I don't know about you, but to me, that sounds like a threat. There's no direct threat there. They're not saying, if you don't ship this game in the fiscal year, I'm firing both of you. But there's a very strong implied threat that I'm going to lose my job and I'm going to take you down with me if you don't ship this game on time. Was that what they were trying to say? Honestly, I think it was, but maybe not. And if not, then I'm not entirely sure what the comment was intended to convey. No real lesson, just a little anecdote so you can understand the pressure that was on this project as it got closer and closer to its ship date. As we're coming into the end of 2018 and the economy is finally starting to exist at all, one thing that's super obvious to everyone is that we've never done a complete economy playthrough of the game. The people in Austin who are going to take over the live service are screaming that, like, how can we ship a live service game without having done this? We need to do this. But effectively, we don't have time. We're getting close to going into CERT. So what we do is we literally hot seat test the game's progression. We have groups of QA, groups of 3 or 4, who will individually play the game for 8 hours, join up with whoever else happens to be on, and then at the end of their shift, pass control of that gameplay over to another QA person who then plays it for 8 hours. So the game is being played 24 hours a day to grind the progression as quickly as possible so that we at least get a playthrough of the progression. And ultimately, that's what the game is shipping with from a progression testing perspective, is a bunch of spot testing and one single playthrough of the progression of the game. Is that enough? That's not remotely enough. It doesn't show you the failure cases. It doesn't show you even really how an individual player plays. Because you're passing control of this set of characters around, people get less attached to that progression because 2 or 3 other people are owning part of that progression. So you're not going to really embed yourself, really immerse yourself in optimizing for what's going on because it doesn't really feel like yours. And one of the things you want from this kind of long testing on economy is to see how people interact with these systems in the real world. While there are cases where people will hot seat play a game just to grind through to the end as fast as possible for bragging rights, that's not a typical way that people play. This is really a lesson for all your testing. You want at least some of your testing to be real, where the people who are testing are playing the game as players, are experiencing the game as players. This isn't all of your testing. There is other kinds of testing that needs to happen. You want some of your testers to be having the experience of interacting with the game as if they were players, so you get that reaction. Of course, with a live service, your progression is going to take a long time. That's kind of the point. So the true answer in most cases is that this is not the kind of testing that you can adequately do in-house. You can do better than was done on Anthem, but you can't really completely do it in-house. The way that you should be doing this kind of testing is in some form of beta environment, where you move from hundreds of people running through your systems to thousands or tens of thousands or potentially hundreds of thousands of people running through your content. This is going to give you a lot better understanding of the reality of the way things are. There wasn't remotely enough time on Anthem to do this and still ship in the highly demanded fiscal year, but in another world, Maybe instead of shipping Anthem in February when it ships, you instead have it enter into a closed beta environment with a few thousand people playing the game for several months to allow you to start the process of ironing out the balance, ironing out the economy, strengthening the end game. This is not the world that we are in at the beginning of 2019. We know the economy is shaky, but we don't have the data to make it better to a significant degree. Anthem had a pretty significant crunch period, and one that was pretty damaging to the employees. When you actually go through by the numbers, it doesn't look that bad. The number of hours that the average person was working was lower than a lot of projects that had come before it. The length of time it went on was a lot shorter than a lot of projects that came before it. But it was more harmful to the employee than any crunch that came before it at BioWare. On the surface, that might not make any sense. Why was a crunch period that was objectively smaller have such a bad impact on the employees? I have a couple of reasons, and together I think what they do is they actually turn a crunch period from something that would have been bad but not that bad into something that is arguably the worst period of crunch in BioWare's history. First of all, traditionally, when people are crunching, they are crunching towards a goal they really clearly see and understand. Ideally, they're crunching for their own passion. They are working really hard to make the thing that they love even better, to make it the best it possibly can be before the game comes out. For the most part, that wasn't the case in Anthem. Lots of people never really understood the game that was being made, in part going back again to the fact that for a long time, the project very clearly said it was not making a looter shooter. So now in the final days, as we are clearly making a looter shooter, this cognitive dissonance is very hard to get over. But also, in Anthem, you couldn't help but feel like the crunch was being imposed upon you because of mistakes that other people had made. We had periods on previous games of very long, required, forced crunch, even sympathy crunch, where we made people work long hours for no other reason than to be around for the other people to see. We didn't do any of that on Anthem. But when you were crunching, when you were working hard to make this game finish, you couldn't help but feel like that was happening because of a mistake that somebody else had made. Maybe a week ago, maybe a month ago, maybe 3 years ago, and you were paying the price of that mistake. The worst example would be the fallout of that really problematic decision culture that the project lived through up until 2017. Because if you were doing work that effectively felt like you were redoing a decision that had been overruled in the past, that's going to feel like shit. That's going to feel like you worked really hard 2 years ago, then someone came in and kicked over your sandcastle, and now, as the game is shipping, you are being told to build that first sandcastle again. Really hard to get enthusiastic about crunching to do work you feel like you already did before. So at the end of the day, the reason why the crunch on Anthem felt so bad, it isn't about hours. It isn't about how long the period of crunch was. What it is was that the cause felt unjust. It felt like you were paying the price for the mistakes of other people. You are paying the consequence for mistakes made by bad leadership. You are paying the cost of mistakes made by other departments. You are paying the cost by mistakes made by other locations. And whether or not that was always the case, that's where the culture had rotted into to some degree. So you can never feel really enthusiastic about shipping a game, especially a game you don't necessarily completely understand, if you feel like you're doing it for reasons that have nothing to do with making the game great and have everything to do with covering for mistakes made by somebody else. I suspect in all of my videos, you notice that as we get really close to launch, things get a little fuzzy. That's because that is when the crunch is worst. That is when I am spending almost all of my time, usually more than 80 hours a week, doing triages. And so things get a little murky for a while. We did do a war room for Anthem. In fact, we were in exactly the same boardroom as we used to ship Dragon Age Inquisition. At this point, our technical leadership for the project is in Austin, so we also have that person in a boardroom, in a mirror war room in Austin, and we are sitting on a Zoom call for the whole day. And I do think that that works pretty well by having a permanent open video conference. After a few days, that kind of just blends it in and it feels like the person is in the room with you. I remember in, I think 2013, EA was talking about building these virtual boardrooms where every location would have a room with a very specific configuration, with a boardroom table rammed into a wall with a projection screen there, such that when you looked into the wall, it would look like the boardroom just continued into space, and then that would be the meeting room that you were having the meeting with. Interesting idea. Don't know how it works with more than 2 locations. Never actually happened as far as I know. And I think since 2013 or 2014, whenever this was being investigated, people have gotten more used to things like Zoom. But the reason I like war rooms is there's a power in the physical presence of being together. And by having that permanent Zoom call, you were actually accomplishing a pretty good approximation of that. Anthem actually had a pretty good technical launch, partially because it had less platforms than we had done for games like Inquisition, but partially because while I would argue that Anthem hadn't learned as much from previous projects that helped it during development, it seemed to have picked up a lot of good habits in terms of actually launching the game from a technical perspective. The process of launching a live service is more complicated than launching a single-player game because in addition to getting the actual executable and data that's going to sit on the disk in a good state, you also have to get ready to have a bunch of servers spin up that are running, in most cases, on totally different hardware, on totally different operating systems. It's not necessarily as different as you might think, only because a lot of single-player games these days also contain some degree of online services, so they are spinning up something, but there's a huge delta between, for example, making sure the Dragon Age Keep is running for Dragon Age Inquisition, and making sure you're ready to have 1 million people spin up dedicated servers, which was the case with Anthem. Before we actually hit launch, I think we have to talk about this thing, this ways to play Anthem chart that was released as we approached the launch of the game. It's largely been made fun of for very good reason, but why does it exist? Well, because people were getting confused about what in the world was going on with the launch of this game. EA has their own subscription service that gives you access to their game catalog. And one of the ways they've tried to attract people into signing up for that thing has been giving early access to games. I'm basically against that policy, but for games like Anthem, games that are multiplayer, the attraction can be pretty strong because I get 7 days early access to a game where the amount that I play is going to give me a competitive advantage against other players. Sounds pretty good. And then as well, at the time, EA had different levels of Origin Access, their subscription service, in addition to it also being different on Xbox One. So you end up with 3 tiers of this subscription service. Plus, additionally, there were pre-order bonuses that were involved in this mix. So you end up with this chart with 20 different possibilities and accesses, whether you get access to the demo, whether you get early access to the game. And we also had different degrees of early access. You got access to the first 10 hours at the lower tiers. You got access to the full game at the higher tiers. So the resulting set of releases was complicated. So we end up with this chart with 20 things on it to untangle that. Is that the right way to go? No, it's not the right way to go. This deserves mockery. It's ridiculous. What should have happened is that we should have collapsed away some of these options. Either give full early access to the game with all the subscription services, which would have removed one entire column. Make the demo accessible to everyone and remove it from the chart. That removes an entire additional column. You could very easily take these 20 different boxes and reduce it down to 5 or 6. And at that point, you probably don't actually need this Excel spreadsheet explaining to you what you're getting with whatever you bought with the game. But EA was pushing this subscription service very hard. They wanted differentiation of the different price points. As a result, we had to break apart some of the offerings, which turns what would have been 1 row and 1 column into 3 rows and 2 columns. If at all possible in your production life, avoid a chart like this. Most of your players aren't interested in working with Excel to determine how they want to interact with your game. So don't do this. Don't make things that are going to add friction to the buying process. I know that you have exclusive versions or premium versions or collector's editions or whatever, but if you have to make a chart explaining to the players which version that they want to get because there is nuance in that purchase decision, you've made a terrible mistake. You can have premium versions of your game. You can have different price points, but if at all possible, what you want is each step up that ladder is simply everything you got before and some new stuff. That makes the buying decision very easy for the players. It also means the player doesn't have to have this ridiculous chart they pull out of their pocket as they're making their buying decision. So we've gone right up to the edge of launch, which is where we will start with part 3. In part 3, we will also talk about post-launch. I'm not as qualified to talk about that as the rest of the game, but we will do our best. And as we've done on all of my other memories and lessons, we will do a little time travel and see how things could have gone differently if different decisions had been made at different points in time. A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. We also have a Patreon if you are more interested in supporting the channel in that way. Both patrons and channel members get access to our Discord, so that's a great way to interact with this community to a deeper level. This video has been in development for a really long time, so channel support does help that kind of thing continue to happen. Since we released part 1, I believe EA has taken Anthem out of their own store, so while in the past I've said, give it a try if you didn't try it before, that's pretty difficult to do now, unless you can find a console copy of the game in a used game store or something to that effect. But if you played it early on, maybe give it a try, remind yourself about the game. There's still fun to be had in there, despite the incompetence of my playing of it. If you found this interesting and you're interested in following for a part 3, you might want to hit the bell icon. Part 3 is going to require a little bit more reworking than part 2 because things have changed since I filmed some of that footage, but it probably won't be too long. We will see you again soon. Thank you.